Okay, so in part one we talked about AV. Let's talk about the other constituent, IP. What is IP? Well, IP stands for Internet Protocol. But before we delve into the details, we need to understand a bit more context. And when we're talking about IP, we're really talking about packet-switched networking. So a packet-switched network is a situation where we have a number of nodes or devices that want to be able to communicate with each other. So to enable that, we're going to connect them together using a network switch to form a network. So now, if node A has got some data that it wants to transmit, it wants to send that over the network to, let's say, node D. And to do that, it needs to essentially take that data and kind of wrap it up in an envelope with an address on. And that address is going to tell the network, I want to send this through to node D. Now, it's worth bearing in mind that this process of putting our data into an envelope or a packet, there is a limited amount of information that we can put within a single packet. And you can kind of think of that as our envelope has a fixed size. So if we're trying to send an entire novel, for example, to node D, we're probably going to have to do it a page at a time. But that's okay. We can repeat this process. So we've taken a page, we've put it into our envelope, and now we're going to send it off to the network. So the network switch then is going to examine this packet, and it doesn't need to worry about what the data is. It's much more interested in the envelope or the packet headers. And the envelope is going to tell it, okay, this is supposed to be going to node D. So the network switch knows it doesn't need to send it through to nodes B or C. It's only node D that cares about this information. So it will send that packet on to node D. Node D will then extract the data from the packet, and we have completed our transmission process. Now, this process happens repeatedly and independently for every single packet that we want to send over the network, which may sound like it's a little bit inefficient to have to repeat this whole addressing and routing process every time we send a packet. But the advantage of doing this is that it means we can have multiple conversations going on the same network at any one time. So this is a bit different to circuit switch networking. And the best example really of a circuit switched network is you may have seen photos of old telephone exchanges where you'd have an operator sat at a large plug board with a whole series of cables and connectors. And the point at which somebody wants to make a telephone call, you have to actually physically connect between one device and another. So you complete the circuit. And that enables those parties to have a conversation. But while that conversation is going on, that entire link now is completely reserved purely for that conversation. So if there are any pauses in the conversation, it doesn't matter. Nobody else can get in and use that connection. A packet switch network is a little bit more flexible. Because we are doing this routing process for each packet that we send, it means that we can actually have multiple conversations going on down a single cable. And this is really helpful when it comes to AV over IP because it gives us a lot more flexibility in terms of how we are using our bandwidth. Okay, let's talk a little bit more about the addressing. So we're talking specifically about IPv4 here. And for IPv4, every node on our network has to have a unique address containing 4 numbers. So something like 10.0.0.1. For every packet that we're going to send then, there has to be a source address and a destination address. And the network is going to use that to be able to route that packet successfully across the network. In addition to the IP addresses, we also have what we call port numbers. And port numbers are a little bit like mailboxes. So we have a single address, but at that address, there can be more than one mailbox. And the idea of doing that is to be able to support multiple services on a single device. So, for example, we can effectively have more than one conversation. We could be sending more than one video stream to a single device with a single IP address. And that can be that we're having 2 conversations between the same 2 devices. It can also be that we are having conversations with a number of different devices simultaneously. So, where this leaves us then, for a situation where we have got packets being sent across the network using IP, those packets are going to have a source address and a source port, and they're going to have a destination address and a destination port, something like this. Okay, well, that's going to tell the network how to send the data across to wherever we want it to go. Are we done? Well, not quite. There are a few different ways then that we can ask the network to route this information. So let's look at a situation where we've got 5 devices on our network. The one on the left there, dot 1, wants to send some information out onto the network. We've then got 4 other devices on the network. Now, the simplest way to transmit information is to send it to a single device, and we call that unicast. So this is a one-to-one connection. And if we're going to send our packets using unicast, we simply specify the destination address and port, and then that packet will get sent only to that one device that we've specified. So that's great if we're only trying to send the data in one direction. What happens if we want to send it to more than one receiver? Well, the other extreme is to say we want to send data to everybody on the network. And we call this broadcast. So broadcast is essentially a one-to-all connection. And we have a special IP address, 255.255.255.255, that we use to do this. And it tells the network, I'm going to send this packet once onto the network, and it's the network's responsibility to then transfer it to all connected devices. This can be very helpful, but especially in the context of AV over IP, you can quickly get overwhelmed with the amount of broadcast traffic on your network. So for AV over IP, that would mean that any video that is being sent on the network, if it's being sent using broadcast, everybody is receiving every video stream, and that's not really practical. So there is fortunately a halfway house, an in-between point called multicast. And multicast is a one-to-many connection. So again, we have a special IP address. There's a whole range of IP addresses we can use for multicast. And we're going to send that packet again once onto the network. And this time, the network is going to send it to some of the connected devices. And there's a mechanism that we won't go into that enables devices on the network to request which streams they are interested in. So in this example here, we have got dot 2 and dot 4 have both said they are interested in the data that is being sent to this particular multicast group. And so they're going to receive copies of that data, but other devices on the network are not. So again, it's the responsibility of the network to make sure that we just send the packet once and it will get sent to multiple receivers. Now, IP then is essentially encapsulation of data into individual packets. We then have to add some addressing so that the network knows where we're trying to send that data. And we need to choose a transmission method to decide, are we sending it to one receiver or to a number of receivers simultaneously? IP is physical layer agnostic. So essentially what that means is it can run on a number of different types of connections. But the one that we are typically most interested in is Ethernet. And I'm just going to talk very briefly about different types of Ethernet. So going back to lower speed Ethernet connections, anything from sort of 10 meg up to about a gig, you might be using a standard bit of Cat5 or Cat6 cable. But once we go faster than that, typically we need to worry about using some slightly different transmission mechanisms. So we're interested in typically 100 gig, sometimes 25 gig, for doing AV over IP at 8K or perhaps 4K. And for 100 gig, we need to typically be using a fiber connection. So for a fiber connection, we have an optical module at either end of the cable. You might hear that referred to as QSFP28. That's the specific type of module that we're using. And then you have a piece of fiber in between those modules. And that can range from a meter long to tens of kilometers if necessary. If you're only going a relatively short distance and you know ahead of time the distance that you're going, rather than having to buy 2 separate modules and a piece of fiber and connect them together, you can use what's called an active optical cable. And that is essentially those 3 elements pre-packaged. You can't remove the fiber from the modules. There's no connectors there, nothing to fall out. And it will connect between 2 devices in more or less exactly the same way as using fiber and 2 optical modules. There is one other way to connect at high bandwidth using QSFP28, which is to use what's called a direct attach cable. And this looks a little bit like an active optical cable, but it's not optical. This is actually a copper cable under the hood, and the main impact there is that you can't transmit over particularly long distances. So typically a maximum of about 5 meters or so, but if you're going 5 meters, you're going to have quite a chunky cable. The further you want to transmit, the thicker the cable needs to be. So there's various ways that we can transmit IP over Ethernet, but once we get up to dealing with 8K video and those sorts of bandwidths, we're much more interested in 100 gig connections and these sort of physical layers that will support that bandwidth. Unfortunately, IP is also quite complicated. And it's complicated not only if you are working with a very small system, so if you're working with baseband and you've just got 2 devices, it's comparatively straightforward. Plug the cable into both of them, you've got your link, you're good to go. Unfortunately for IP, it's a little bit more involved than that. IP can come into its own when we're talking about larger systems, but for larger systems, it is also at times quite complicated, especially as the system scales up and you need to start worrying about the architecture, how you've configured your network, and think about the ongoing maintenance as well. So I don't want to downplay the complexity here. We're not going to be talking in any more detail about IP. We are just covering the fundamentals. But it is worth bearing in mind that it can get quite complicated quite quickly. It is worth having somebody on hand who is hopefully an expert in networking if you're going to be doing AV over IP.